The gospel we call Luke, written by an anonymous first-century author, could never have been written without the gospel called Mark existing first. Even inspired, Luke is a literary document, and as such it depends on Mark. But in composing his gospel, the anonymous author we call Luke also used the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint as his source. This is evident when comparing what Jesus is reported to have said from the Isaiah scroll in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 through 19, with Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2 in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew and Greek versions differ, and Luke used the Greek version admirably well to make many points for his gospel. Consider Luke chapter 4, verses 14 through 21. The gospel story about Jesus in the synagogue reading from Isaiah. This story does not prove that the historical Jesus was actually literate. Besides, the supposed passage that the Lucan Jesus reads is a jumbled mess of different verses of the Greek version of Isaiah that Luke spliced together. No scrolls in Jesus' day featured such an arrangement. This whole thing is a Lucan original. If a gospel reader has an eye or ear trained to discern patterns in ancient texts, she or he should notice that the verses of Isaiah read by Luke's Jesus are arranged into a pattern commonly found in ancient literature. Look here. This concentric arrangement of ideas leads a reader or listener to realize that the ideas of these lines are similar, and also that the ideas of these lines are similar. It is line C that stands out. That's the focal point of all these verses. That's the main point that the Lucan Jesus wants to make. In fact, a quick reading of Luke and Acts of the Apostles, his second volume, reveals that one of Jesus' major activities in this gospel is restoring sight to the blind and granting understanding to the unenlightened. But many people challenge and reject this understanding or insight, whether given by Jesus or by his disciples. Just see how Luke concludes in Acts chapter 28. The first scene from Jesus' ministry in Luke's gospel prepares the reader or listener for what is to come in the remainder of the gospel. Besides offering new understanding to his audiences, which is what line C is talking about, Jesus will free people from bondage to demons. And Jesus will restore meaning to people's lives by healing them. See these lines. It is for this total ministry that the Spirit of God has anointed the Israelite Jesus. And that's why Luke uses the quote from Isaiah to disclose the plan of his gospel and Acts of the Apostles. We have been exploring the famous passage of Luke chapter 4 where Jesus reads from Isaiah in his hometown synagogue. But the author we call Luke wasn't writing fact-precise Western biography or journalism. Since not everything he presents is historical or factual, we should ask the question, could the historical Jesus really read? Understood in a restricted sense, reading is the ability to decode linguistic symbols by looking at a written text. People learn alphabets and words. Then, they learn how to communicate orally by combining the words in patterns that are intelligible to others. Some also learn how to identify the letters, words, and patterns in written communication, thus gaining an understanding of what the writer or author intended to say and actually meant. Because in our 21st century world, opportunities to learn how to read are so widespread, and reading materials are affordable and easily accessible, people today forget what a complex skill reading is. Study of Middle Eastern peasants, illiterate by UNESCO standards, reveals surprises for many Western people. For example, many people in the Middle East today memorize the entire Quran and can recite it verbatim, from memory. How is this possible when they cannot read in our contemporary understanding of the term? As Dr. Amy Jill Levine says, many Galilean peasants were, like the Middle Eastern peasants of today, hearing readers, or oral literate. That means that they could remember and understand what was read aloud to them. The Matthean Jesus seems to consider his own disciples hearing readers when he reminds them of what they had heard when others read the Torah to them. Confident that they understood what was read, the Matthean Jesus was able to present a new perspective on these sections of the Decalogue, in the antitheses. Considering that Jesus' immediate circle of inner followers were hearing readers in this sense who could not write, helps us clear away fundamentalistic nonsense of those who demand that the historical Matthew and historical John were the actual authors of the Gospels that bear their names. Perhaps an equal number of Galilean peasants were repeating readers, or oral literate. Such people could remember, understand, and repeat substantially, if not literally, what someone had read to them. Scholars recognize that when the Pharisees challenged Jesus about his disciples plucking ears of grain on the Sabbath, Jesus justified their behavior by alluding to King David's similar deed of assuaging hunger in the house of God. "Have you never read what David did?" asks the Markan Jesus. Now, when a 21st century Bible reader consults 1 Samuel, she or he might become embarrassed to see that the Markan Jesus has misidentified the high priest. It was not Abiathar, as Jesus claimed, but Ahimelech. Abiathar was high priest when David was king. Ahimelech, his father, was priest when David ate the consecrated bread. Jesus, how could you have made such a mistake? Perhaps Jesus did not remember accurately what he heard, or what he personally read, if in fact he could read. Or maybe it was the author we call Mark who was mistaken. Maybe he was responsible for reporting the wrong name. Whoever made the mistake, Jesus or Mark, was not reading from a text, nor was the text literally memorized. The allusion to that event very likely was made on the basis of a memory of that passage, which was heard when another person read it. Doesn't the Bible prove that Jesus was literate? 3 passages in the New Testament seem to suggest that Jesus could in fact read and write. However, all of these are polished and reflect stage 3 of gospel development. The context of elite literate scribes who authored the Gospels, belonging to 2% of the total population. They do not reflect stage 1 of gospel development, the actual life situation of Jesus, a Galilean peasant artisan and day laborer. Let's examine each of these. First, in the case of the woman caught in the act of adultery, Jesus is reported to pause in the conflict to bend down and write with his finger on the ground. Speculation about what he might have written covers a wide range of guesses, but the most plausible explanation is that he doodled. Mediterranean men under stress often doodle in an attempt to buy some time in order to come up with an appropriate, sarcastic comeback, or to avoid losing one's temper and doing something regrettable, and so forth. Moreover, this particular story was not originally part of the 4th gospel we call John. Sometimes, in ancient manuscripts, it is reported in Luke's gospel. Some even think that it is a much later creation. If it does in fact preserve a reliable tradition about Jesus' life and writing at all, then doodling has the highest degree of plausibility in the cultural world of the Middle East. Doodling is hardly literacy in the modern sense of the term. In the second case, of all the evangelists, only the one known as Luke presents Jesus as truly literate, or specifically oculiterate, that is, capable of linguistically decoding what he reads with his eyes from a written text. The authors known as Matthew and Mark portray Jesus as a repeating reader, one who repeats what he heard others read, like many Muslims do today with the Quran. The story, of course, is Jesus in the synagogue. The Lucan Jesus is in his village men's community center, synagogue in the first century, not a place of worship. There, Jesus reads from the Isaiah scroll. Moreover, he interprets the passage for his listeners. Scholars are divided about the facticity and historicity of this passage. Remember, Luke is not giving his readers biographical live at 5 video footage of something that actually happened. Moreover, he's a spinmeister. A first century David Axelrod or James Carville. He makes his heroes look good. So the information about Jesus actually reading from and interpreting Isaiah may be a later addition. Indeed, the verses that the Luke and Jesus reportedly read and reported are a jumbled mixture of Isaiah. What scroll would contain that arrangement? So, despite its promise, this passage too is not helpful for understanding the Jesus of history. Finally, in the third passage, when Jesus began to teach in the Jerusalem temple, the Judean men asked, "How is it that this man knows his letters when he has never studied?" This question leads us to a consideration of formal education that results in scribal literacy. Ultimately, none of these passages proves that the Galilean peasant Jesus could read or write. Studies of the ancient world propose that not more than 10% of that population could read and write. Some scholars think that the select group may have been as small as 2 or 3% of the total population of ancient Israel. Others go beyond, saying that it is likely that in Herodian Palestine, only 0.5% could read.
Jesus was almost certainly illiterate. That's a little shocking to modern people. But there were no schools in Nazareth, none. And Israel had the lowest percentage of literacy in the entire Roman Empire, 0.5%.
If Jesus, a Galilean peasant, read from the scroll of Isaiah in his village synagogue, does that mean he belonged to an elite minority somehow? That would be bizarre. And where did he learn how to read? If he could read, did he know how to write? Were the scribes with whom Jesus was so often in conflict his former classmates? And what did they write? These questions do not have simple answers, but we know enough about literacy in antiquity to offer some educated guesses. Again, God meets us where we are at, something scholars like Amy Jill Levine beautifully communicate many times. To my fellow Christians listening to this who are offended at the idea that Jesus was illiterate, relax. It's okay that Jesus was a peasant. You cannot take incarnation seriously without taking the prefix in seriously.